Hello, and welcome to Monday at 8. And today we're looking. Oh, hang on, I'm talking to myself here. Let me just turn that down. So, yesterday we were looking at the passage in Matthew chapter 8, where the Roman centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant. And I've got a couple of things I want to talk about with that, and I've got a couple of questions as well that have come in by email. Hello to Steve and hello to Sue, who are both have just commented in the chat. I will just, as always, keep my eye on my emails and on WhatsApp for those of you that aren't able to chat in the chat. So I thought I would start by something that didn't make it into the sermon, but might be interesting or helpful to somebody possibly. So Matthew chapter 8, if you've got a Bible with you or you've got a Bible on your phone, it might be worthwhile just having it accessible. So in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 7, or in verse 6, the centurion comes to Jesus and tells him, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. And in the NIV, we then read that Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? But if you look in other versions of the Bible, such as the ESV, which is the English Standard Version, it's not a question, it's a statement. Jesus says, I will come and heal him. Because, as we mentioned last week, in the original, it's just all a string of letters, there's no punctuation. And so it's not always obvious whether something is a question or not. And you have to make a judgment call often based on the context. And so I thought what I would do is just quickly flag up what are some of the differences between some of our modern translations of the Bible and which ones might be good ones to use. I regularly prepare for stuff using the NIV and the ESV, which is why I was immediately aware that this was a question in one version, but not a question in the other. So let me just show you. I have my amazing notebook again with another outstanding diagram. So this is I'm almost guaranteed that you're seeing this the right way around, but I'm seeing it back to front, which makes it a little bit difficult for me to read from the screen because it's all mirrored. It's a scale between literal translations, and you've got dynamic translations and free translations. And then you've got some examples of different Bibles that follow that particular strategy for Bible translation. So you've got at the very literal end, you've got the King James Version, and then you've then got the NRSV, which are the Bibles we used to have in the church, and the ESV, as I say, which is one that I use on a regular basis. So they're more towards the literal end. What that means is that they will stick as close as possible to the Greek. They'll often rearrange the word order so that things are a little bit more, you can still read them easily, but they'll stick to kind of, and you'll see what I mean by this in a minute when I talk about a dynamic translation. They'll stick to kind of a more literal translation. There is somewhere online I use somewhere that's got something. It's called I think it might. It's not Young's, but it's something literal translation, and they literally translate it kind of word for word, which makes it really difficult to read because obviously Greek grammar or Hebrew grammar and English grammar are different, and so it can be quite difficult to make sense of it. Most of us are probably familiar through church with the NIV That's a dynamic translation. The Good News Bible is another dynamic translation, but pushing up towards the free end. And then in free translations, you've got things like the Living Bible, the New Living Translation, and the Message. Now, let me explain what I mean by literal and dynamic. So, for example, if you were to look at Matthew chapter 20, verse 3, there's a verse that contains a reference to time. The English, the ESV, the English Standard Version, translates the Greek fairly literally as at the third hour, whereas the NIV recognizes that translating something as at the third hour might not be that helpful for us to understand exactly what time of day is that if we don't know that the clock kind of went from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then 6 p.m. through to 6 a.m. And so the third hour is 3 hours on from 6. So the NIV translates it, rather than putting the third hour, which is the literal translation, the NIV puts it as at 9 a.m. or 9 o'clock in the morning, which means the same thing, but it's not strictly speaking what the Greek says. They often also do this quite often with money. And so you might have the English Standard Version might translate the Greek as something like 10,000 talents, and then use the footnotes to explain what a talent is, whereas something like the NIV might translate the same passage as something like 10,000 bags of gold. The Greek doesn't say anything about bags of gold. It says talents, but it's just kind of it's more of a dynamic translation. And then some of the freer the translations up towards the free end might even translate it as in terms of millions of dollars, so many millions of dollars. So they try and help you in the understanding by making it a little bit easier, but it's just pulling a little bit away from the original Greek. So that's why I usually use 3 versions when I'm preparing stuff. So the ESV is my more literal one, the NIV is my more dynamic one, and I use NIV kind of for my own personal Bible study. I think it's a good translation overall. And then I'll also use the Good News Bible as well. So that's a little bit on translation. Because I say if you and I regularly will read stuff in at least two different versions when preparing things for like sermons or Bible studies, because then it just flags up. I mean, it would have been very easy to have kind of gone down a rabbit hole following the kind of, if Jesus was asking this guy a question, well, shall I come and heal him? But it may not have been a question. It might have been a statement, but you wouldn't know that unless you'd read something from a different translation, and it's then at least flagged up that it's an issue, and you can then decide what you're going to do with that. I've had a couple of questions. Remember, if you've got any questions, you can put them in the chat. If you want to respond to anything I'm saying as I go along, you can put it in the chat. Let me just check my emails quickly. Oh, that's okay. So I mentioned on Sunday about target audience and saying that Matthew's target audience was Jewish readers or hearers. So he's kind of more. You can see as you read Matthew as compared to say with Mark or with Luke, that he's got a lot more Old Testament in there. So the question was, well, if Matthew's target audience was Jewish, what did Jesus have a target audience? Was Jesus and if he did, what was Jesus' target audience? I just picked out a couple of verses from Matthew chapter 10, 5-7, and Matthew chapter 15, 21-28, which would suggest that Jesus did have a target audience, and it was the lost sheep of Israel. So Matthew 10, 5-7, Matthew 15, 21-28. There are obviously occasions where, like in the story we read yesterday, where he's dealing with Gentiles. There is a story, in fact, it might be the Matthew 15 one. When I say Matthew 15, 21. Yes, so in Matthew 15, 21, a Canaanite, so a non-Jewish woman, has come to ask Jesus for help to heal her daughter, and she keeps on going because Jesus doesn't answer. And Jesus says in verse 24, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." And because she carries on, Jesus grants her request and makes a comment about her faith. I think the thing with target audiences, particularly maybe when we think about this in terms of say some of the stuff with digital church, for example, is we're not saying and with a target audience, you're not saying that your ministry is only going to be given to this type of person. It's open to anyone to respond to what you are doing, but in terms of your strategy, you prepare your strategy with a particular kind of person in mind. And so Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience, but we can still get a lot out of it because even though we're not Jewish, and so it's not that you can't read it if you're not Jewish, but when Matthew was writing, he was writing with that kind of person in mind. What are the sort of questions that they're going to have, and looking to address those kind of issues? And then Mark would have done a similar sort of thing. Luke would have done a similar sort of thing. Wouldn't Matthew have presented this as the audience because that is his audience in terms of whose Jesus' audience was? Well, yes, but Jesus says, is it there or is it in the other one? I mean, certainly Jesus engaged with Gentiles in a way that no self-respecting Jew of his time would have done so. But I think going around preaching about the kingdom of heaven suggests he's got a Jewish audience in mind, because talking about the kingdom of heaven wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense unless you came from a Jewish background. But I say that doesn't stop anyone else responding to it. It's just in terms of his approach and his strategy. Yeah, so I mean, when in Matthew 10 verse 5, when he's sending out the 12 disciples, don't go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans, go to the lost sheep of Israel and proclaim the message, the kingdom of heaven has come near. As I say, obviously Jesus, John 4, Jesus goes through Samaria, and the passage we looked at yesterday, he's talking to a Roman centurion. The passage in Matthew 15 is a Canaanite woman. So it wasn't that he was exclusively just to the Jews, but I would say his target audience was a Jewish audience. And then the other question I had was, again, Matthew 8 and verse 11 says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And the question I was asked was, well, which feast? What feast is Jesus talking about here? And again, interesting aside, if you look up this in the ESV, it says, it doesn't have the word feast in there at all. It says recline, about you'll recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the literal Greek means. But when reclining at the table is kind of what you do when you're in that culture, when you're eating together, having a feast. And so that's kind of the picture that's being created, which is why the NIV translates it the way that it does. There's nothing specifically that I could find in the Old Testament that talks about a feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but certainly the image of kind of what's going to happen in the future in terms of the coming of the kingdom of God. The New Testament often uses language of a feast, of a wedding banquet, of some kind of big event involving food. Isaiah 25 verse 6 was one verse I did find that probably these things are bouncing off of. So Isaiah 25 verse 6. So this isn't a passage praising God, but on this mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. And in that day they will say, and it goes on. So an image of a day at the end of time, using the language of a feast. Certainly a number of Jesus's parables use kind of the image of a wedding banquet. He talks about the kingdom of God is like a wedding feast. There, Luke chapter 14 and verse 15, Jesus says, someone comes to Jesus and say, blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. And so certainly it creates the impression that at that time there was the expectation was that the coming of the kingdom of God will involve a feast. And then of course in Revelation chapter 19 verse 9 it talks about the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so I think what Jesus is talking about here, sorry I've lost it again, is the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Is he's again not necessarily, I don't think we should necessarily think of this as being literal, but he's creating an image that creates a picture for us of what is going to happen at the end of time. When the kingdom of heaven comes, it will be a feast, it will be a celebration. People will sit down together and eat together. Say there's no comments in the chat, or no further comments in the chat. There's no emails, no more WhatsApps. I've answered the questions that came in by email, so I'm going to finish up there. So thank you very much. I remember that you can catch this again during the week. Just use the link, and by tomorrow or the next day there'll be something on the church website and the church YouTube channel as well if you want to watch it back there. So thank you for your comments and those of you that sent in questions, and yeah, I will finish there. Goodbye.